Kicking off a 4-week series on that topic of God and science. So tonight I'm speaking. I'll actually be back next week as well. So this is kind of part one of part two of a two-part series called Has Science Buried God? And then Kevin will be speaking the week after that. And as you heard, in 3 weeks, we're going to have a question and response night. So yeah, please ask your questions. Anything's on the table, we'll see what's upvoted. And Matthew and I will tackle them. I'll joke, he gets all the hard ones, I get all the easy ones, but I'm sure that'll probably end up being flipped. So with that, please use the Slido, and let's dive in. So, again, has science buried God? That's a deep question. To me, it's a fun question because science is amazing. It's fun, it's exciting, it's all around us, and it has this ability to take what seems only imaginable and make it into a reality. Right? Science has done so much to improve the human condition and to explore our universe. We've sent men to the moon. We've basically tackled and cured diseases like polio and smallpox. We've developed incredibly powerful wireless portable computers. Mine's an iPhone 8, probably not as powerful as most of yours. I'm a dinosaur. But the influence of science isn't limited to just those who study STEM courses and work in STEM fields. It's all throughout literature. So, for example, if you like the classics, there's H.G. Wells' Time Machine, War of the Worlds, anything ever written by Jules Verne. You also have more modern works like Skyward by Brandon Sanderson or the Maze Runner. Shows up in pop culture, all over the place. You've got Jurassic Park, which they just keep pumping out movies. You've got Iron Man. You've got Avatar. You've got Star Trek. You've got Ready Player One, and on and on and on. These movies incorporate deep scientific themes, or they incorporate scientific technologies or ideas that seem like they're just around the corner or over the inevitable scientific horizon. We'll talk about this more next week, but science and the Bible actually align very, very well. Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." You see, we worship a God who is rational and wise and designed an orderly universe. And so we expect to find, when we go and do science, a universe that is predictable, that is measurable, that is describable, as well as beautiful and awe-inspiring. And when scientists go about their work, that is precisely the kind of universe that they encounter in their work. See, again, science is all around us, and questions about science, they're not just for scientists, they're for everyone. Because the evidence of science is relevant for answering some of life's most important and fundamental questions. Questions like, does God exist? What does it mean to be a human being? What is our universe, and where did it come from? None of us can face or should face these questions dispassionately or without interest. The universe is far too amazing and far too incredible for that. So it's important to evaluate the evidence in these questions with clear thinking. But to do that, we need to debunk some common but ultimately false views about science that can cloud our thinking and get in the way of that, of thinking clearly about the evidence that science has to offer. In other words, I think there are some right ways to think about science, and I think there are some wrong ways to think about science. I call each of the wrong ways a myth about science. And so tonight, in the time that we have, I want to unpack 3 of those for you. Now, let me mention the small tome of paper that you found on your seat. I want to mention the handout. This isn't just to cure someone's insomnia, but what I've done is I've taken a number of books I've read over the years, a number of talks I've heard, and I've tried to boil it down into a useful resource for you. So it's heavily footnoted. I actually cover 5 in this. I'm only going to cover 3 tonight. And I've actually put a section at the end, like common questions, common objections, things like evolution, things like the Bible being anti-scientific, things like the treatment of Galileo by the church centuries ago. So I encourage you to read that. Again, everything I'm going to say tonight, I go into way more detail with way more quotes, way more resources. By all means, fact check me. I invite you to. I want you to know what you believe, why you believe it, and why it matters. And you're going to hear that a lot here in youth group. So I encourage you, run down these resources, ask questions. But I also have one other thing I want to ask. If you don't want to read the handout, you will not offend me. But please take it home. And when you get home, give it to the adult or adults in your home, because I bet you they'd like to read it. And when they inevitably ask you, what'd you learn tonight? What'd you cover? What'd you talk about? You can hand it to them, and then, hopefully they're off and reading for the next 20, 30 minutes and whatever. So please take it home, and please use it as a resource. I've built it and designed it with you in mind, because when I was in this season of life, this is something I would have loved to have had that I didn't have. It was hard to find. So with that, let's dive in. Myth number 1, science can explain everything. Here's a common view. This is articulated by John Lennox. This is actually not his view. He's one of my intellectual heroes. He's got 3 doctorates, very, very smart man. He articulates this view. Science is an unstoppable force for human development that will deliver answers to our many questions about the universe and solve many, if not all, of our human problems. At some stage in the future, science will be able to explain everything and answer all of our needs. Again, that's a common view, that science has or will have all the answers that we'll ever need, that science can explain everything. Now, this view has a related idea that goes by a name called scientism. Scientism is the view that the hard sciences alone have the authority to give us knowledge of reality. In other words, we can't get at the truth, we can't get at knowledge apart from science. That's what scientism holds. What science can't discover, mankind cannot know. Meaning science will deliver all the truth we'll ever need. Again, that's a common view, but it's actually a very problematic view. Here's why. There are, in fact, well-recognized limits to the questions that science can answer and the things that it can tell us. For example, science can't tell us why the Mona Lisa is a masterpiece. Science can tell you that adding poison to someone's tea will kill them. Science can't answer the moral question of whether you should add tea to or poison to your grandmother's tea to kill her so that you can get your inheritance sooner. By the way, obviously you shouldn't. But science can't answer that kind of moral question. It can tell you what will happen. It can't tell you morally what you should do. There's a brilliant Nobel laureate, won a Nobel Prize in Medicine, named Sir Peter Medawar, who's knighted for it. He writes this in his book, Advice to a Young Scientist. He says, there's no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and upon his profession than roundly to declare that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking. In other words, a question doesn't become a non-question. It doesn't become irrelevant or pointless if science can't answer it. People who work in ethics, people who work in philosophy, people who work in fields of art and literature, those fields fall largely, if not entirely, outside of science. There's much that science can answer, there's much that it can do, but there are certain realms of knowledge, certain kinds of questions it's not built to answer because it's the study of the natural world. Also, that claim that science has a monopoly on truth, it actually is very easy to see that it's false. Here's why. Because it's actually a self-defeating statement. So think about that statement. Only science can lead to truth. Only science can lead to truth. The problem is that's not something we can know from science itself. That's a philosophical statement about science itself. So that claim, only science can lead to truth, you can't demonstrate that scientifically. There's no experiment you can run, there's no laboratory test that you can do to prove that. That means that the central claim of scientism is itself, it's either unknowable by its own terms or it's false by its own terms. That's incoherent, that's self-defeating. Now, if that was a little quick, again, I encourage you, go back to the handout, reflect on this, but here's the point I want you to take away. There are really well-recognized limits to science. There are things it's just not built to answer because that's just not what it does. It's meant to study the natural world, things like physics and chemistry and biology, not moral questions, not questions of aesthetics. In other words, and additionally, just because science can't demonstrate something or can't answer a question doesn't mean that it's unknowable or irrelevant. There are limits to it. It's important, it's valuable, but it has limits. It can't explain everything. So myth number 2, scientists are always objective and unbiased. We need to keep 3 things in mind when it comes to science. First, science itself doesn't make any claims. When you hear something like science says or science tells us, that's actually not true. That's an inaccurate or sort of vague, improper description. Because science doesn't talk. Scientists talk. In other words, it's people who speak, not science itself. Secondly, we need to remember that not everything a scientist says is itself a statement of science. There are many things scientists say that are statements of their own personal belief, for example, not reasoned conclusions of science that they've come to from their work. Because again, science is a tool for studying the natural world through observation, through experimentation. It's up to scientists to interpret the data that they get from their work, and they don't always do so in a way that's fair and objective and unbiased. Third, like all of us, scientists have assumptions, they have biases, they might have both, that they bring with them to their work. Those come with them into their laboratory. Now that term bias, if you want to know what that means, a simple definition, it's a preference for or against something that can inhibit fair or impartial judgment. You can think about it like a motivation, or it's something, again, that keeps you from being fair or impartial. It's a preference or it's a motivation. Now, we all have this. This is a human thing. We all have assumptions. We all have biases. And the trick when you go about your work, whether you're a scientist, whether you're a historian, whatever it might be, is just to be aware of it and take it into account. It doesn't mean you can't be objective. It just means that you have a motivation, you have preferences, you have assumptions. Be aware of them, take them into account, acknowledge them, and don't let them prevent you as much as you can from being objective in your work. That's typically how researchers and scientists are meant to operate. Now, one of the really common assumptions that some scientists hold is a view called materialism. Now, this is a claim that our reality consists entirely of physical matter, physical stuff, that is the sole cause of everything possible that occurs, including human thought, feeling, and action. So again, it's called materialism. Reality consists just of physical matter. Matter is all that there is, and it's the cause of everything that happens. So I hope you can see right away, when you have that assumption, when you bring that assumption with you to science, or anything else for that matter, right away at the outset, that means there's no God, because God is immaterial. So if you're a materialist, you wouldn't posit an immaterial reality like God. John 4, for example, says God is spirit. It also means that there are no souls. It also means that nothing supernatural happens because nature is all that there is, meaning there's no miracles. So if you're a materialist, if that's your starting point, so is atheism. I just want you to see that connection. If you start as a materialist, that means you're also starting as an assumption as an atheist. By definition, you've ruled God out. Here's how this can get problematic. So the point I'm trying to make is that scientists are not always objective. Here's a quote from a geneticist at Harvard, a prominent guy named Richard Lewontin. And he admitted this some years ago in a book review. Here's what he says, and I have a longer version of the quote in the handout. I think it's a very important, very well-known one. He says, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment." There's that assumption language. We have a prior commitment to materialism. And here's the key point, this last sentence. "Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So I want you to see, I hope you see, that word cannot with regard to the divine foot, that's not based on scientific evidence. Here's a prominent Harvard geneticist saying, I don't want God in the picture. It's not based on science, it's based on his starting point. It's also not a reasoned conclusion. It's certainly not a statement of science, even though a scientist is saying it. This is actually a statement of Richard Lewontin's personal belief, which I would say is certainly not impartial. It borders on the irrational, because he says right away, our materialism commitment is absolute. It's not provisional, it's not tentative, it's absolute. We can never allow a divine foot in the door. Once that foot gets that crack in, God's going to blow it wide open. So we're going to keep that thing locked tight forever. Now the problem is, if you start with that assumption of materialism, like he does, you're always going to end up, one, again, not believing in God, and two, seeing a conflict between God and science, where I think there isn't one. And that takes us to our final myth, myth number 3, that there's a war between God and science, or a battle, or a turf war, and therefore good scientists don't believe in God. Good scientists don't believe in God. Here's a quote, another one from Oxford professor of chemistry, Peter Atkins, very British gentleman. He's very clear on this point. He says, "Religion has failed, and its failure should stand exposed. Science, with its currently successful pursuit of universal competence through the identification of the minimal, the supreme delight of the intellect, should be acknowledged king." In other words, you're a Christian or you're a scientist. Because if you're a Christian, you've checked your brain at the door. Or have you? Now, this is actually wrong as a matter of history and as a matter of fact. There's simply no conflict between God and science. In fact, belief in God has inspired a great deal of scientific inquiry and discovery over the centuries. Think about it logically. If there really were a conflict between God and science, here's what we, a priori ahead of time, should expect to find. We should expect to find that all scientists, or at least most scientists, at least the ones that get it, they're all atheists. Scientists should be atheists, and it's only non-scientists who should believe in God. If there really were a conflict, that's what we should see. Scientists are atheists, it's the non-scientists who believe in God. That's not what we find in history at all. It's not what we find in modern times either, and I'll get to that. Historically, the great minds of science, men like Galileo, Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Faraday, Babbage, Mendel, Pasteur, Calvin, and Clerk Maxwell, they were all theists. Most of them, in fact, were Christian. And if you don't know those names, if there were a Hall of Fame of scientists, they would all be in there. They would all be first ballot inductees, unanimously, because these were like the giants of their fields and at that time, and they did so much important work. Their belief in God, far from being a hindrance to their science, was actually the main inspiration for it. For example, Clerk Maxwell, he discovered the equations of electromagnetism that set up Einstein's work. He, in his Cavendish lab in England, he had a psalm inscribed above his laboratory door. Now, those guys are all old and dead. Okay, how about modern times? Well, there's a guy named Alan Sandage. He's the father of modern astronomy. He won the Crawford Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize for astronomy. He discovered quasars. Here's what he says. I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something instead of nothing. Okay, well, he's a big deal. He won a prize. What about the rank and file scientists? Okay, well, in 1996, so a little while ago now, but not that long ago, there was a survey done in the very prestigious journal Nature. And they surveyed 600 scientists, and they didn't just ask them, do you believe in God? That's sort of generic or generalized. But they asked, do you believe in a God who answers prayer and in personal immortality? That sounds a lot more like the biblical God. 40% of them responded that they do. 40% of the 600 scientists, about 240, responded that they believe in a God who answers prayer and in personal immortality. Baruch Abba Shalev wrote a book called 100 Years of Nobel Prizes. He looked at the more than 700 Nobel Prizes awarded in the 20th century between 1901 and 2000. 423 of them, 65.4%, were awarded to people who identified Christianity in its various forms as their religious preference. And I've got a breakdown. It's the highest for peace, 72.5% for chemistry, 65% for physics. It only dips below 50 for literature. So these are all this is the breakdown. This is in his book. He's got tables about all kinds of different, their political views, all kinds of things. But 65% identified Christianity as various forms as their religious preference. Now, that's not 100%, but that's not my point. Again, if there's a conflict between God and science, why do we find, like Hall of Fame scientists believing in God? Why do we find the guy that discovered quasars, being a Christian and a scientist? Why do we have 40%, not zero, not 1%, but 40% or 65%? Those sort of numbers are why I think that's a false narrative, that there's a conflict between God and science. Again, if that were the case, we should expect that number to be around zero. It's so much higher. I'm not saying it's 100, but it's far above zero. So we can ask, why should belief in God inspire scientists? Well, the answer is because at the heart of science lies a conviction, and the conviction is that the universe is orderly. I mentioned this earlier when I talked about Psalm 19. Science has advanced because scientists expect, when they go to their work, they expect a universe that's describable, that's predictable, that can be mathematically modeled. And they have this expectation right from the Judeo-Christian worldview, right out of the Bible. So here's another Nobel Prize winner in biochemistry. His name is Melvin Kelvin. Here's what he wrote. I know, it's like two first names. He says, and he's talking about that conviction when you do science, the universe will be describable and understandable. He says, as I try to discern the origin of that conviction, I seem to find it in a basic notion, enunciated first in the Western world by the ancient Hebrews, namely that the universe is governed by a single God, and is not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to his own laws. Here's the key point. It's this last sentence. This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. And I've got more quotes about this in your handout. Again, this monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. In other words, rather than science having buried God, what we find is that belief in God has actually historically been essential, very, very important, foundational to the rise of the scientific age here in the West and especially in Europe. Now, I'm not saying that all aspects of the Christian faith or Christendom have contributed to the rise of science. I'm not saying that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But historians of science, this is the point. Historians of science, they recognize this doctrine, this idea of a creator God who's responsible for the existence and order and design of our universe. That's played a very essential and important role in the rise of modern science. So the point I want to make here is that God and science, they're not in conflict. They're actually very compatible. We see this over the centuries, starting with Galileo and Kepler and all those guys and moving forward to today. Again, 423 Nobel Prizes last century. So as a Christian, you can hold science and your belief in God. You can hold science and the Bible in high regard. It's not an either or, it's a both and. You don't have to check your brain at the door to be a scientist, or to be a Christian, far from it. I like the way Proverbs kind of talks about this. It sort of captures in ancient wisdom terms this modern idea. Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." It's like God has hidden that we might discover. He's our loving Father. He's wonderfully beautiful and artistic and creative. And it's like he's left us clues and given us a universe that's almost like a playground or a sandbox. So this verse, I think, is a reminder that God invites us to search out. That's the glory of kings, but search out, explore, discover his creation and its workings with a sense of wonder and delight. God invites us to do that wholeheartedly. So to wrap things up, I mentioned again 3 myths that I wanted to dispel. Number 1, that science can explain everything. Number 2, that scientists are always objective and unbiased. And number 3, that there's a conflict between God and science. If I could reframe those, remember I said we want to dispel or debunk false views about science. If I could put those in correct and true terms, here's how I would summarize these 3 points. Number 1, there are well-recognized limits to science and the questions it can answer. Science can do a lot. It's amazing. It can explain a lot. But there are limits to it and the questions it can answer. Questions of morality, beauty, aesthetics, meaning, things like that. Secondly, scientists bring their biases and worldview assumptions with them to their work. After all, they're just people. It doesn't mean that they can't do a good job. It doesn't mean they can't be objective at times. I'm just saying they're human. They're capable of it. Like we saw with Lewontin, sometimes it's not always rational. I'm not going to let a divine foot in the door kind of thing. And then thirdly, you can be a Christian and a scientist to the glory of God. Lack of belief in God is neither a requirement nor a guarantee of good science. You can be a Christian and a scientist to the glory of God. And I'm not saying everyone needs to go work in the STEM field, but if you want to, I want to give you the encouragement and the reassurance. You can do that wholeheartedly, enjoying God's creation, exploring that. You don't have to check your brain at the door. Not by a long shot, and you'll be in very good company. I know there are Christians that walk the halls here of GBC and who are scientists as well. Let me close this in a word of prayer. Father, I thank you for the beauty of your creation. Your servant Paul writes in Romans 1 that your eternal power and divine nature can be seen from what's made. Lord, we can look to nature and just see your artistry, your handiwork, your beauty, and know, God, that you have created this wonderful universe for us to explore and inhabit, God. So we thank you for your creativity. We thank you for giving us knowledge of your existence and just giving us the freedom to explore your creation, God. I pray for all the young minds here, Lord, that you would gird them with truth, Lord. Help them to ask good questions and to ask us good questions that we can help them navigate and answer, Lord. We commit this time tonight to you, and we give you thanks for your Son.